Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this important conversation. For decades, we've defined sovereignty by our borders and our land, our airspace, and our laws. But in the 21st century, true sovereignty is increasingly defined by data, our data. As we face the growing realities of climate change and natural disasters, geopolitical upheaval, the question is no longer just about rebuilding our physical infrastructure, but about who controls our ability to sustain or recover the digital nervous system. Today, we explore the concept of disaster resilience as a sovereign right. This is not merely about survival. It is about the right of our nations to maintain autonomy, access, and control over critical information, even when our physical borders are under threat. I am joined by Giovanni King, Chairman of the Caribbean Datacenter Association and CEO of Blue Nap Americas, and Eamonn Sheehy, Senior Director, Public Sector Cloud Carib, who are leading the change in building a Caribbean federated cloud as a cornerstone to disaster resilience. What we will discuss today are not just technical upgrades, they are the tools that will allow our region to pool resources, ensure redundancy, and maintain our independence when it matters most. Before we begin, a quick reminder, we'll have a question and answer session at the end, so please feel free to drop your questions in the chat or Q&A box at any time during the conversation. And we're off to a good start. So, Giovanni, we will start with you. In the digital age, sovereignty is defined not only by borders, but by control of infrastructure and data. From a Caribbean perspective, what does digital sovereignty mean in practice, and why is it becoming such an urgent priority for our region?
First and foremost, Lee, Eamonn, CANTO, and all of those joining us this afternoon to discuss this subject. Thank you very much for having me. Well, Lee, I think with your introduction, you basically already indicated as we move from, having defined sovereignty as being, our borders and all of the elements that you mentioned, and also breaking down the importance of where we are today as we are going to a process of digital transformation. We're talking about data classification, data repatriation. We can't do this within a vacuum. This is where our infrastructure, the importance of having the correct infrastructure in place, makes it so that that's where we are defining sovereignty. If we start with sovereignty over our infrastructure, it enables us to have sovereignty down the line, meaning also to our data. So making investments in infrastructure to support this development is very, very critical. And then breaking it down to see again, what is it that we need? I think there is always an analogy that I like to use is that as we as a region understand the importance of our tourism industry, and we have made the investments to make sure that this industry is thriving, we also need to look at our whole electronic communication, digital transformation process as in the same way, and looking at the elements that enables us or guarantees us the sovereignty of dealing with our own data, protecting our own data within our own jurisdiction. So creating infrastructure sovereignty by starting with, for instance, our subsea connectivities, our cable landing stations, our internet exchanges, our data centers, and even the infrastructure that allows within individual jurisdictions for constituents to have access to information is very important. So that's where we need to focus. In addition to that, if we want to create a resilient infrastructure, we need to also realize that we have small communities and small economies. So in order for us to use the diversity of our region in a way to create an infrastructure that is resilient and robust. We also need to look at how do we leverage the infrastructure that is in place within our different islands to guarantee that we can create an infrastructure created and built by the region to support the need or to support the responsibility to guarantee sovereignty.
Eamonn, do you have something that you want to add to that?
Yes, indeed I do. And I certainly agree with everything that Giovanni has said. And I think from the perspective of Cloud Carib, we have been promoting the concept of sovereignty for about 10 years now. And it's no accident that things are happening now. I mean, why there's an urgent priority or appears to be a political urgency about this now. A lot of countries are implementing a GDPR type legislation across the region. And if you've only got to look at what's happening in Europe, where they're trying to de-risk because they can't meet the GDPR standards by hosting information in USA hyperscalers. A simple example of that is recently the University of Dusseldorf did a study for the German Interior Ministry saying, well, if we host the data in Germany, but it's in a Azure or AWS cloud, will we be subject to extraterritorial legislation like the USA Cloud Act? And the comment came back, or the study found that yes, most likely you would be. So if we then just look at what's happening in Europe and we mirror that to say the same could happen in our region, then we have to take sovereignty, digital sovereignty, as something that's very important. I think the other part that you touched on, Lee, at the very start in your opening comments was geopolitics. And unfortunately, already we see it before our eyes. In the war that's happening now in the Middle East, data centers were hit, services were knocked out for the entire region. We see also more recently or previously sanctions being put on members of the International Criminal Court and stopping them accessing services which were hosted by US hyperscalers. So I think the region has realized that we need to actually de-risk. We need to de-risk and we need to start taking responsibility for ourselves and supporting our own infrastructure in a sovereign, sustainable way. I think that message was clear at the CANTO last year in the Bahamas, when Prime Minister Davis made a reference to it on a number of occasions. We've had Prime Minister Mockley here in Barbados reference it on a number of occasions. And indeed, yesterday, when the Minister for Information Technology, Minister Reid, made his opening remarks in Parliament on the estimates, again, the issue of sovereignty came up. So it's clear that there's a need to de-risk, and it's clear that there's a need to nearshore data and systems because of the current geopolitical and GDPR requirements. And not mention the last thing I'll mention on this, of course, we hear the old saying, data is the new oil. So we need to have access to that data. When we need to have access to that data and how we need to have access to it, we need to control that.
Oh, great. And if we reference, Eamonn, your data is the new oil, then automatically we think about revenues and cost and money. So we'll go directly into that. Building a resilient digital infrastructure does require significant investment. So from your perspective, what are the most critical infrastructure investments that the Caribbean must prioritize today to ensure a long-term data sovereignty and resilience?
Well, I think Giovanni touched on this already in his opening remarks. Subsea cables, for example. I mean, from what I have understand and studied, nearly 40% of the subsea cables in the Caribbean are coming to end of life or are at end of life. That's a critical infrastructure need. And I think there's clearly, if you look at the maps of the subsea cables, there needs to be more interconnectivity in the region for redundancy and for resilience purposes. And these are pretty big investments that need to be done. I think also implementing internet exchange points. I know some countries have it, many countries don't have it. We need to build out internet exchange points so that data that's local stays local and data that's regional stays regional without bouncing up and down to North America and back again. From our perspective as a managed service provider, we've been speaking quite a lot about this topic, which is capital cost versus operational cost. And using managed services, because governments particularly spend a lot of money on ICT, servers, software, all of these different things. And this money is not always spent in the best way. So our position is that if we go to an operational cost model, there's this elasticity in cost. Cost only comes with a business need, but a cost can also be reduced when the business need is no longer there. And if I look at something like cybersecurity, for example, when I look at the research of what a cybersecurity expert can command in a salary, in North America, it's like 140,000 US dollars a year. In Europe, it's 140,000 euros. Which government can afford that in the region for one person? So when we use managed service providers, the costs of these kinds of things are spread over all the clients. It makes it significantly more sustainable. So I think that from a Cloud Carib perspective, large companies, governments need to look at moving from this capital cost model that has not necessarily delivered for countries to a more sustainable operational cost model where the costs are predictable and where replacements are baked into the contracts and services that you have with the private sector entities.
Okay, Gio, I know you touched on this. Is there something you would like to add to this to continue from Eamonn's?
Definitely, they must. This may sound boring again when I say I agree with what Eamonn has just said. But what I would like to add, as we look at the different elements required to have a sovereign infrastructure, the subsea cables, the neutral cable landing stations, the data centers, exchanges, as Eamonn has mentioned, and the aspects of local infrastructure to guarantee the last mile. We need to look at one, the aspect of operational cost coverage, as Eamonn has alluded to, but also look at more or other innovative ways to fund these projects that are heavy in investment costs. One of the things that we always talk about is the fact that the Caribbean consists of 34 different countries and territories, and that as a population, we are now talking about 46 million approximately, as opposed to, if I look at Curacao, 150,000. And then if we look at the Caribbean diaspora, those numbers can even grow. So again, I'm no expert in this part of financing, but if we're looking at, for instance, see how we can fractionalize or tokenize, or how we can use stable coins to guarantee these investments, we open up ways that foreign investors and Caribbean diaspora can also contribute to the construction of this to the financing of this infrastructure needed. What I also think that it could enable is that each island doesn't feel the need to go in and build what already exists in the region. Like each island, if we invest by purpose as opposed to just for the sake of investing, we don't need to have 10 different tier 4 data centers within the region. We don't need to have 34 different subsea cables that have a huge amount of capacity that we will not be able to use on each of the individual islands. If we're looking at how to use, for instance, at what Eamonn has indicated, the different exchanges that already exist, to make sure that the capacity available in island A is now leveraged to island B, C, and D, that means that the investment can be shared amongst each other. And if in one way or the other, through tokenization, through stable coins. Now, if again we look at BlueNap, we can give a friendly island like a stake in the investments made in BlueNap, meaning that they now feel that BlueNap is part of their infrastructure that can guarantee the sovereignty of their data. That's when we're starting to create this digital economy for the Caribbean based on what's available within the Caribbean. One of the things that I think is very important is that as much as I'm managing a tier 4 data center, I think in order to elevate the level of sovereignty, each island should have a facility in which they would host their most critical infrastructure data, but they need to have the ability that in case of a natural disaster, they could move this data to whichever island they are they have an agreement with, where they feel that their data is going to be protected to the utmost. So we need to look at alternative ways of making these investments as well, and looking at public-private partnerships and all possibilities, and not take all of these investments on our own.
So if we're looking ahead over the next 5 to 10 years, what would success look like for the Caribbean in terms of digital sovereignty? And anybody can grab it first.
Well, I'll put my 2 cents in first then.
Okay.
First of all, again, I guess we'll be, myself and Giovanni will be saying this back and forth, just as Giovanni has said. I think a structured, tiered set of data centers across the region will be very critical for withstanding hurricanes and natural disasters. Will be very important. They don't all have to be tier 4. Many can't be, but at least the level that is reasonable, a tier 2, a tier 3, and a tier 4, and that we would have an environment where we could share resources. So, and I think this is particularly, again, talking about governments not having to reinvent the wheel and each government operating in isolation. If there was a regional mechanism for sharing resources, when you need a certain type of resource, you could just buy into it. It's already there. You're not waiting to have deliveries of infrastructure and servers and the like. And we can see already with the supply chain scenario, that kind of thing can delay projects by a considerable amount of time. So having a shared pool of resources operating across data centers that are interconnected, that IXPs are interconnected, and then we can come to, which I know we'll be talking about at some point in time, and it's going to be a big issue next week at the CDA conference. Interoperability becomes an issue between cloud service providers and between organizations that want to share information. And I think there with the launch of the Caribbean Gaia X Hub, hopefully next week in Curacao, that will be putting something that's not conceptual anymore. It's something that's going to be practical, that will allow people to access it. And I think that then creates an environment where in times of natural disaster, we will have the trust and the infrastructure and the interoperability to share information and move systems quickly between countries. And then the more, even though it's not disaster resilience, I think on a more, let's say, not practical is not the right word, but recently we have 4 countries in the Caribbean that have opened their borders for free movement of people, that they can live and work in Belize, Barbados, Dominica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So you can imagine that if you had a shared pool of resources, you had an interoperable platform, like a federated cloud that I'm sure we'll be talking about, that when I move from Barbados to Belize, my medical records, my social security, my educational qualifications, that the entities in Belize can make a request to have that information provided to them so they can verify my credentials and verify who I am and things like this, and do it in a seamless way. That is a vision, I think, that we should be aiming for in the next 5 years. 10 years is a very long way away. I would say within the next 5 years, things are moving very quickly. We should be down that path considerably.
I again, Lee, support everything being said, and I would like to add, as different islands in the region are building or are working towards creating digital public infrastructure to be used for digital IDs or for the trusted transfer of the cross-border transfer of information. This goes to what Eamonn has just indicated. I think creating a level of trust between islands, showing how we have this interoperability between the infrastructure, maybe building not only regulatory sandboxes, but also sandboxes that would help to create trust, so that we can create the frameworks that are going to be used in the future. This is how we need to move forward. There are multiple islands in the region. I am aware of at least one that I think are moving kind of ahead in this development, which is Turks and Caicos Islands, where they're building a DPI sandbox for digital ID. that we can learn from them and again move forward as each and every one of us come to that. As Eamonn has mentioned, we are looking at executing the Gaia X hub within the region. Again, we're talking about interoperability and talking about the federated cloud that then will be on top of it, which will facilitate cross-border data exchange. If we enclose this in a sandbox, again, we can then share our learning experiences with other islands so that they can make the decisions to join what we're technically making available to the whole region, that we can lower basically the hurdles for others to communicate with us, and then also to make the step to join this federated cloud, because it would help not only to create to lower the level of trust that we have, but also to support one of the most, let's say, the documents that we are basing this on, which is the Carib single ICT space. So not going back and creating something new, but building on what those before us already did to show that it can be done within the region. And from the Gaia X perspective, not only would this be something very innovative, it would be great to see how our region is taking the first steps into using these standards and norms to show how we can have that sovereign approach to data exchange and not be dependent on one or multiple, global hyperscalers.
I think I'll just add one last thing on that one, because I think with the Gaia X, the Caribbean Gaia X hub, once it's up and running and registered under Gaia X, it also becomes part of a network of Gaia X hubs globally. And that then provides with a potential economic benefit for companies to do business in a trusted manner with companies in Europe and in Japan and places like this. So it has the potential to add value by creating a potential economic export facility through the trust platform of the Gaia X hub.
So staying on the Gaia X hub, I know that the Caribbean Data Center Association, Cloud Carib, and BlueNAC, we've all been promoting the concept of the Caribbean Federated Cloud and the Gaia X, in which multiple islands can support one another in the event of a disaster. Can you explain how this model works in practice and how it changes the way the Caribbean nations would think about disaster recovery?
Who's
Eamonn?
that for? Oh, okay.
Eamonn?
Okay. So the first thing is that Gaia X enables a federated and secure data infrastructure where data can be shared, users can retain the control over their own data and access and usage of that data. So the key kind of functions of the hub is compliance, first of all, ensuring that participants meet the necessary standards, policies, and rules. So it is like joining a club. There are rules, there are policies, and there are requirements for those who are joining. Federation then is the part that enables the interoperability and the portability of data sets across different sectors. And the final part then of this pillar is data exchange. And here the hub provides the tools for secure, sovereign, and controlled data transactions. And this collaboration will then, I think, turn individual island efforts into a unified regional defense against natural disasters. So that's in a non-technical way, I would like to say, I've tried to describe it as best I can.
If I can add to that, one of the things that I also really like is as we progress or transform, hopefully, from a region that mostly consumes digital services to now developing or producing digital content that then can be monetized in a proper way, building on our diversity. I think that's one of the very important aspects of this whole ecosystem as well, as you can create within the system multiple different levels of trust through which you can then control who can get access to your information, and then in a safe way, also working at monetizing the data that you're now making available for the rest of the world. I think that's one of the aspects that I hope that next week at the Digital Caribbean Conference, this can also be discussed, as we have Gaia X principles talking about the different opportunities. But in addition to that, again, if we go back to disaster recovery aspect of our subject today, it's that you can move within different data spaces. You can move your data around, guaranteeing that even when we're hit by a disaster, governments still can have access to their most critical information, so that they can guarantee, the safety of their constituents.
Gio, just to continue on that statement, then how does this hub ensure that data remains under the sovereignty of the Caribbean, while still allowing collaborations needed in the event of disaster response?
I think that's a layered type response. First and foremost, I think when you go back, it is important to start at the foundation, right? So what I see and how I see it is that if an island is potentially going to be hit by a natural disaster, it is important for them to have identified, let's say, friendly islands or friendly data centers with which they have bilaterals or multilateral agreements that can guarantee that once I move my data from my data center in Curacao, for instance, and then put it in Trinidad and Tobago, that data is then being respected as being Curacao-based information, and will be dealt with in the same way or within the same legal framework as within Curacao. So that's step one. As Eamonn has mentioned, interoperability is then the next thing, because you're taking the first step, which is legal, and then you move it to a technical aspect of to guarantee the interoperability, to guarantee the direct connectivity, that your data doesn't need to do a world tour before it hits the data center in Trinidad or when it's coming back, that you can establish security across the digital pathway that your data is going to be using to move from one data center to the next. And then you take it to the next level, where you're now creating the data spaces in which you can do whatever it is that you want to do. So when you look at it in that level, and that's the way it should be done.
Okay. So disasters often create vulnerabilities for cyber attacks. How can the region ensure that the push for digital resilience does not inadvertently weaken cybersecurity? Eamonn?
Well, let's say the first, I guess I can say Cloud Carib, we have some experience and expertise in this area because we have our virtual data centers spread across 10 countries in the region. So we know about the vulnerabilities, we know about shifting workloads where necessary. And just as a kind of an aside to the question, in 2025, across our infrastructure and the infrastructure we manage for our clients, we had to deal with something like 2.2 billion cyber events. 2.2 billion. And that's just Cloud Carib. And that's a 4.5-fold increase compared to the previous year, because of course, the hackers and attackers are now using AI to speed up the processes. So it is a very valid question. And I think I would answer it by saying we need to have standards. And as we have across our integrated virtual data center environment, we apply the same standards to every single node. And the kind of standards we have are industry standards, like the ISO 27001, the SOC 2 Type 2, CSA Star Level 2, and even within our command and control centers, because we have two of them, one in Greece and one in the Bahamas, all our staff are ITEL certified. So there's a standard set of procedures on how to react to incidents. And we need to have those standards in place. It can't, because we're moving in a the SIDS are moving towards digital transformation, and that's really the kind of the buzzword and the goal and scope of many things. Digital transformation. Once you go down that path, you can no longer operate in best endeavors mode. You have to operate at something at a much higher level. And the thing that gives the trust, even in the sense if we look at GDPR legislation and what a data processor can do, the data controller has to ensure the data processor meets certain standards. How do you do that? And the way we would say we do it, including managing vulnerabilities of cybersecurity in events of natural disasters, is to have relevant certifications, audits by external parties on a regular basis, which we do, that are ongoing. That way, at least you know that you're operating at the right levels all the time, 24/7, 365. And then you can apply the appropriate mechanisms that will need to be applied at that time for that particular incident. And one example I can give is that I think in Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, we have 2 data centers, one in Freeport and one in Nassau. And because of the nature of the natural disaster, we had to do a controlled shutdown of the data center in Freeport. But we were able to do that because we have applied procedures and standards that met the threshold for us to do this kind of thing. And we can apply the same across the region. If all of the managed service providers are operating at the same standards and the same levels, then we have an infrastructure that doesn't have a weak point. And we always know what to do in the case of a crisis.
Again, agreeing here. And that's one, if I then change from being a rep for BlueNap and talking about Caribbean Data Center Association, this is one of the things that as an association, we advocate for. As we are basically working towards creating a cluster of interconnected data centers, we also need to make sure that the data centers that are part of the cluster, and we hope that all islands will have multiple data centers that become member and then also connect and be part of the fabric. One of the things that we need to guarantee is that our members then meet the requirements of a level of certification. And it could be whichever, if you're following uptime, if you're doing the ANSI TIA 942, whichever it may be, so that not only us as members know what level of certification you have, but also that the different governments know what level of certification the data centers where they trust their information to be are complying with. And then take it to the next level. It's not only about the physical data center and the equipment certification, but it's also certification when it comes to the human resources that we are having within our facilities. And what we have mentioned in the beginning, because we are now leveraging the capacity across the region, we should also be looking towards how do we leverage the human resources, because we know there is a shortage in different areas, and it is impossible for all of us to have that expertise in-house. But then how do we use this, and how can the Caribbean Data Center Association help in facilitating or connecting and making available these experts so that we can have that level of trust that we're talking about.
So, Eamonn, do you want to add something there?
I think the only thing I would add, just as you talk about the expertise, I mean, let's say for us, our company, our business is managed service provision and cybersecurity. So we have to have the expertise. So we have something like 45 engineers that have got 400 certifications across 30, 40, application platforms and environments. But that's our business. That's our business. Is that the business then of a government or a country or a commercial operator? It might not be. And I think that's, as Giovanni said, we have to leverage the expertise whose business is to be the experts in this area, and not necessarily reinvent the wheel and try to take some shortcuts and take some, I mentioned before about the cybersecurity expert. Do you think that if a government trains up somebody to a certain level, that they're going to stay with the government salary when they can get a lot more somewhere else? I mean, and then you get into this cycle of training and people leaving. Leverage what is available in the region, in the private sector. It also helps to grow the industry sector itself, and it adds value to the economy. And I think that is the metric by which both innovation and sustainability will certainly meet.
Yeah. So how does the region then utilize local data centers to host AI-driven disaster models without relying on external servers?
Well, if I can jump on that one,
Yeah,
I think
you guys are in line, so it's flowing.
um, the last few weeks I've been asked similar type questions about how do we now leverage the need for, let's say, AI/GPU compute power within the region, and once we do that, how do we meet the energy requirements to run this um, compute power and all of the other aspects that comes with it. And again, here I think it's important not to basically blindly steer, and Eamonn from different operational aspects has also indicated to this, not to blindly steer that everything necessarily needs to be within the Caribbean on each in each individual island. As we are, most of us, smaller islands with smaller economies of scale, when you're looking at the use of AI services and GPU compute, um, you can divide it in different aspects, right? So you could be building a large language module, which would then require a lot of power, which maybe not all islands will be able to generate. But we can look at our neighbors in Latin America, where they have you know a lot of energy available. Or we can look at, for instance, a part of the Caribbean, Guyana, where they are looking at building and where they also have, this energy availability. And we then run the bigger AI plants within data centers that have this access to the available energy. And then we do the inference part in smaller facilities, like, for instance, the facility not small, but the community smaller, like in Curacao, not to put additional pressure on energy production within the island, but to use it smartly. And we can do that in multiple islands. If you're looking at only and solely at, for instance, the need to availability of a lot of energy, we can also look at what's happening, hopefully in the future in Dominica, where they are preparing, or they're already, it's an ongoing project to generate geothermal power. How can we leverage that power to then host AI necessities from a facility within that jurisdiction? So I think about building for purpose and not just for the sake of building. We need to come together, look at what our needs are, and then basically strategically look at where do we do what. If, for instance, we need to build a data center that's going to focus on a financial sector mostly, why do it in an island where the expertise on the financial sector isn't there, but it is in Barbados? Then we need to look at doing it there. And I think we can identify for each island what it brings to the table, and then build and use the facilities to the max and have the expertise in place, so that we don't go out and reinvent, and then everybody has the same thing twice over duplicated, but then none of it basically makes sense, because none of us can basically generate enough revenue to make it a sustainable endeavor.
And I would like to, just to add on to that, and along the same lines, because we in Cloud Carib, we are, let's say, testing AI at the moment. We use AI internally in our own organization, and how we approach it is a bit like what Giovanni was saying, on a use case basis. So each specific use case, you understand what the pain point is, you make the business case to identify what the return on investment will be, and then you implement the model appropriately. And to just give a very simple example, if it was to take 3 days to draft some kind of a briefing paper, but your AI model could do it in half a day, is that good enough? It doesn't need to be 5 seconds or 2 seconds or 1 second. And the implication of that is then you don't necessarily need a big machine. You can use a mix of GPU, CPU, because you're shrinking the cost and the requirements down to meet what is the appropriate KPI for that particular use case. And I think that's something that we have been addressing and examining and testing for use cases, specific use cases. Now, on the question that you did ask, Lee, about the weather maps and various things like this, how to prediction. Funnily enough, NVIDIA has just announced the availability of a number of weather models. And one or two of these don't require a huge amount of GPUs. And as a matter of fact, in Cloud Carib, we're now examining the implementation of one of those models in a sandbox environment to test, because we have enough resources to do it, to test it, to see how it will work. So what we can see is that whereas before for modeling weather, which is quite complex, required supercomputers, now already with AI and with the GPUs, the footprint for doing this is getting smaller, and the ability for localized, let's say, weather analysis and predictions up to 15 days can be practically done in a reasonable AI platform and environment. And if I add to that then, as we build out our own AI infrastructure, just like we have with our cloud infrastructure, we can start to share the resources. We can pool resources. So you can see, for example, at the time of the hurricane season, if regionally or locally we need to do some modeling with our own data, we could pool the AI resources in the region to do that modeling and manage that process. And then when we don't need to pool the data, then the AI infrastructure can continue to operate individually, doing whatever use cases it was already built to do. So we have the flexibility to implement common structures and pool AI resources that allow us to leverage AI and maintain the data in the region as we need it.
So we have 2 or 3 questions from the attendees, but I still have one question, and you guys need to make it a short response so that we can give everybody else the attention that they deserve. But how can we formalize a sovereign resilience compact in the Caribbean?
Well, if you ask me, we are on the way of doing this. I mean, the first step was creating the Caribbean Data Center Association. The second step is to go out and make sure that we have the regional data centers become members of this association. In addition to that, to bring partners to the region that could add to expertise and knowledge development. And after 3 years of existence of Caribbean Data Center Association, we are doing good work. As we can see, the membership increase, as we can see the associate membership increase, and as we can see the participant numbers in our annual event and Digital Caribbean also increase. The next step, if you ask me, is to expand on our engagement with governments, where we are going to advocate not only for them to participate actively in expanding the footprint of Caribbean Data Center Association, but to also discuss and talk about what our policy frameworks needed to meet their requirements as it relates to security certifications and development.
I would have a slightly different slant on this question. So there is a United Nations Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. That framework has been there since about 2015, and a lot of countries have signed up for it, and a lot of the Caribbean SIDS have actually produced their their national resilience disaster frameworks out of this framework. So there is a body of work that exists on disaster mitigation based on a common framework. And maybe one of the things that could be addressed is how do we get these frameworks into some kind of a model legislation at regional level, and to make sure that it covers digital infrastructure, for example, because maybe a lot of the frameworks for focusing on buildings, roads, bridges, things like this, are maybe not so in depth in the ICT space. I mean, I don't know. I haven't read all of the strategy papers, the national strategy papers, but there is a framework there that is a UN-based framework that many countries have already produced their strategies from. And how do we leverage those strategies to bring this sovereign resilience compact into some kind of a legal standard that everybody will operate off of in the region?
Okay, thanks, guys. So I'll switch over to the Q&A section. We have a question from Mr. Daniel D'Souza, who's founder of My Carib, a Caribbean social network platform focused on connecting Caribbean people, businesses, culture, and tourism across the region. For those of you that do not know of My Carib, now you do. Please check it out.
It's a good advertisement.
Yeah. And Daniel's question is, as the founder of this social network platform, one of his concerns is where Caribbean user data should legally reside. From a digital sovereignty standpoint, should regional platforms prioritize storing Caribbean citizens' data exclusively in the Caribbean data centers, such as those operated by Cloud Carib or BlueNap, or is it multi-region redundancy still recommended for disaster resilience? Gio, do you want to take this one first?
Yes, I would say it's a tiered approach. As we collect more information, I think one of the next steps would be that governments or even private entities need to go in and do data classification. Once you do data classification, you can identify your most critical data and your least critical data that you can deem as being public. And then basically everything in between is then for you as an entity to define how critical is it. And as I indicated in the beginning, I think that each island should have a facility, again, built for purpose. And then this data that you define as most critical and that you want it to reside within your jurisdiction, that should be placed within your jurisdiction. I would then also advise, because you don't want to have a single point of failure, is to have the multilateral or bilateral agreements with what I then always call friendly islands or friendly data centers. And within those agreements, you then specify how you want that specific data center or island to deal with your information, so that in case of a calamity, a disaster, you can move that data without having feeling that you're not trusted or that your data is going to be misused. Then, as you go with every classification, it could be so that you can, if you go all the other way to the spectrum, you could say, well, no, this is public information anyway. This data, I'm going to put it outside of the jurisdiction, maybe even if it's based on cost or whichever other consideration. But once you classify, you can then determine based on the importance of that data for your organization, for your entity, where and how you deal with it.
I think it's
Eamonn,
also,
anything to add?
Yeah, I think I would just very briefly say, if you're talking about the disaster resilience and, okay, from a social media point of view, from that application that you mentioned, they probably have a lot of personal identifiable information. So then you have to obviously conform to the GDPR legislation of the country that you're in. But then if you're going to do disaster risk mitigation, there are enough, like BlueNap is out of the hurricane belt. For example, we have a facility also in Canada. It's out of the hurricane belt. There are options there. It's not just that everything remains within a hurricane belt, although we can shift the loads around. And again, as Giovanni said, you have to categorize your data, and then you have to know the legislation. But for sure and certain, what we can say is that if you have that data hosted with a USA hyperscaler, then that data is subject to US laws. And that's a simple fact. So you may not be in conformance with your own local law if you can't guarantee that the jurisdiction that covers that data is the jurisdiction it was created in.
Okay. I hope this answers your question, Mr. D'Souza. And I have a question from Mr. Dixon Oswala, who is with Digicel Group. We all know Digicel. An application from Starlink to launch 1 million satellites to facilitate the setting up of orbital data centers has recently been made to FCC. What are your thoughts on this development, considering that an orbital data center could store data at a country or regional scale in alignment with ITU satellite orbital slot allocations? It's a long question. Should I repeat it? Okay.
If I can jump
No.
into it, again, it goes to rules and regulations. As much as I would say, well, I embrace such a technological development, we need to look into what are the risks of, because even though the data centers are in space, there's risk involved as well. When it comes to communication, when it comes to whichever collision of whatever happens out there in space, but also who in which country, as Eamonn has mentioned, in which country is this organization incorporated in? What rules and regulation apply to that specific organization that is then providing the service? And if you know what rules and regulations should apply to your data, that's when you determine how do you use whichever facility that there is. Is it in space? If it's under the sea, because there are developments with that as well. If it's on land or wherever it may be. It is something that we need to look into, not only from the aspect of now my data is in space, but from a jurisdictional policy perspective.
Yeah, and as the questioner said, Starlink, well, Starlink is a USA company. It's subject to USA legislation. And we've already seen it's like a single point of failure. If you put all your eggs in one basket and for whatever reason you're cut off from access by I mean, we've seen it with Starlink in Ukraine. When they didn't get paid, they cut access to their Starlink station. So it's a risk mitigating issue that has to be really evaluated. And would you want to put all your eggs in one basket that is totally foreign controlled and beyond your scope to access if you really need to access it?
Okay. Another question. One of my concerns as a Caribbean social network is disaster resilience. During hurricanes, platforms can become essential for real-time weather updates and helping families reconnect. What best practices would you recommend for ensuring that a regional platform like ours maintains uptime and data integrity across multiple Caribbean jurisdictions during a major disaster?
Well, I could just quickly respond because I think we've kind of covered this earlier on.
Yes.
And we mentioned about applying standards, industry best practice and standards will always work, not just best endeavors. And again, I will give the example of for Cloud Carib, we had to operate the government data centers in the Bahamas during Hurricane Dorian. And because we have rigid procedures and practices that are industry gold standards, we were able to operate the data centers right through Dorian without any incident and kept all the applications running. So that is, I think, the answer to the question. It can no longer be best endeavors. It has to be serious, certified, independently certified, whether it's the data center itself, the physical data center, or the infrastructure, or the management of services or cybersecurity. All of these things have to be managed in a consistent, serious way. And that by doing that, you will mitigate most of the risks, if not nearly all of the risks.
Okay.
I do nothing to add.
Perfect. Last question is again from Mr. Oswala. Would existing terrestrial data centers pivot to providing non-terrestrial alternatives to address data sovereignty issues and entrenching much needed disaster resilience to extend network infrastructure?
I do think that collaboration is part of the totality. Again, we have small economies, so making multiple investments that would add more cost to the operationalizing of our facilities. I don't think that's something that we need to look into. So again, what I would say is we should look at what's available out there. We should collaborate as there are facilities within our region, outside of our region in Europe, as Eamonn has made available, as connectivity becomes more and more accessible and even, at affordable pricing. You can have, as a regional data center, a collaboration with a data center that's outside your region within a jurisdiction where you can guarantee that the data is going to be dealt with based on the agreements that you then have with each other. BlueNap, for instance, has agreements with data centers in Europe, and these agreements then outline how whichever data that we store or analyze there is dealt with based on the rules and regulations that apply to us within Curacao. So that means that these are the things that we need to look at. And I think by having collaboration, by having an association, we can then share knowledge. We can then share experiences. We can create sandboxes to show how this can be done in a way that gives us that level of trust. And on top of that, to come back to one of the subjects that we discussed in the beginning, using a federated cloud, using the trusted environment created by the rules and regulation standards and norms from an organization as Gaia, we can then, I can say totally guarantee, but at least work towards something that gives us that peace of mind. And because we are members of the Gaia X fabric, we can also suggest in future meetings how we can see or how we think certain changes can be done to create something that is more directed towards our regional needs.
Eamonn, anything to add? No.
On this case, not a thing. I
Okay.
fully agree with Giovanni.
Great. So as we wrap up today's session, please mark your calendars for our next CANTO conversations happening on Thursday, 2nd April at 12 p.m. AST, that is Caribbean time. And the topic of discussion would be the freedom to build telecom your way. This session, the Caribbean operators and telecom experts discuss how modular core networks and multi-vendor strategies empower local teams to evolve on their own terms. They will explore how to avoid vendor lock-ins, optimize investments, and deploy adaptable carrier-grade solutions without compromising on quality or scalability. We'll also touch on the critical role of inclusive network strategies in connecting undeserved areas and closing the digital divide. The registration link could be found in the chat. And at this point, if you have or would have an interest in continuing your knowledge on data sovereignty and the direction of the Caribbean Data Center Association, together with Cloud Carib, you can follow us on the social medias of Caribbean Data Center Association, Cloud Carib, and BlueNap. At this point, thank you, CANTO Conversations, for this opportunity, and we definitely hope that we will see you guys in the next session. Feedback is much, much needed, so please reach out to us or to Andrea at any point in time. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.